Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Radical pleasure conversation happening. We're going to give it just a few more seconds to let folks kind of plug in, come in into the conversation. Welcome for everybody joining us. Welcome. Get comfortable, grab a seat, grab a notebook. We're about to go to school a little bit. Very excited to be here. Get settled. We'll be starting very shortly. Okay. I hope you all are settled and ready to get the conversation going. Welcome to our kickoff Inhale Exhale event, Radical Pleasure. I am so excited to be having this discussion. My name is Pascal. I will be your host for this evening. Thank you for joining us. I hope that you folks are ready, like I said, to be taken to school. Grab your notebooks, get comfortable. It's going to be an amazing night with amazing gems dropped across our way. I am calling in from Toronto, traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Mississauga of the Credit River. This is also the dish with one spoon territory, a treaty that bounds the original inhabitants of this land to be able to share it. Subsequent indigenous nations, newcomers, refugees like myself have been invited here within that same treaty. I also want to say, in welcoming the land that we are here, or acknowledging the land that I am here calling in from, I also want to say conversations regarding decolonization and mental health are not isolated. When we think about mental health, conversations around mental health, we enter it from a decolonial lens. We complicate normative discussions around mental health to really think about what does mental health support look like in a patriarchal, heteronormative, white supremacist state. Ultimately, we know the fight for radical pleasure, radical mental health is intrinsically connected to the fight for Indigenous sovereignty. I find myself here very grateful and very blessed to be leading this conversation and to be calling in on the land that I am situated on. I am also very grateful for Across Boundaries to be hosting this. I am going to get us started by passing us off to our first speaker, Roger Love, who will be speaking on behalf of Across Boundaries.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very delighted to be here for this very insightful conversation. Again, my name is Roger Love. I'm a board member with Across Boundaries and a human rights lawyer. On behalf of the board and the leadership of the agency, I welcome each and every one of you this evening. Across Boundaries has been proudly providing mental health and addiction services to racialized and Black communities for over 25 years, recognizing that racism, oppression, and anti-Black racism at the individual, organizational, and systemic levels have many negative impacts on the health and well-being of our communities. In March 2019, Across Boundaries engaged in an event known as The Gathering, where we were fortunate to have met over 80 members of the Black LGBTQ++ community. They came together there over 2 days and provided input on what has worked for them in accessing mental health and addiction services, what hasn't worked, and specifically what Across Boundaries can do to serve the 2S LGBTQ++ communities better. The rich dialogue resulted in a report which we're able to use as the foundation for many conversations with funders and donors, resulting in dedicated staffing and programming, expanded hours of service, and the ability to provide services where people are at. We have more to do and a long way to go, but we are confident that we're on the right track. We look forward to continuing to engage with you as we evolve and develop new partnerships and new programming. This evening, I personally and on behalf of the board, we look forward to hearing from Ericka an individual who reminds us to continue to ask critical questions, to continue to push boundaries, and to continue to be self-reflective about how our identities are centered within society. Tonight is a celebration of that journey, and we thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Roger. And thank you once again to Across Boundaries for hosting this and allowing us to be able to come together virtually throughout this time and hear from Ericka. I'm so excited for this conversation. I'm so excited to hear everything that Ericka has to share with us. I also want to let folks know that there will be a Q&A happening following her talk. So again, get your notebooks ready and get ready for your questions for Ericka. Without further ado, I want to introduce our keynote speaker for Radical Pleasure, Pleasure as a Means for Revolutionary Mental Health, Ericka Hart. Ericka Hart is a Black queer femme activist, writer, highly acclaimed speaker, and award-winning sexuality educator with a Master's of Education in Human Sexuality from Widener University. Ericka's work broke ground when she went topless, showing her double mastectomy scars in public in 2016. Since then, she has been in demand at colleges and universities across the country, featured in countless digital and print publications like Vogue, Washington Post, Allure, Essence, Vanity Fair, and more. Ericka's voice is rooted in leading edge thought around human sexual expression as intrinsical to overall human health and its intersections with race, gender, chronic illness, and disability. Both radical and relatable, she continues to push well beyond the threshold of sex positivity. Ericka Hart has taught sexual education for elementary-aged youth to adults across New York City for over 10 years, including for 4 years at Columbia University's School of Social Work and the CUNY School of Public Health at Hunter College. They are currently an adjunct faculty member at Widener University's Center for Human Sexuality. Thank you so much for being here, Ericka. We are so excited to hear from you. I pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Pascal, and thank you to everyone, the community of Across Boundaries. I'm so delighted to be here this evening. I know that this has been a long time in the making. I think this was the gig that I went to. I'm in New York, I'm in Brooklyn, to the New Jersey airport to get on the flight to go to Canada, and the flight was not canceled, but it was just a lot of trepidation around traveling. I had full-fledged gloves on, a mask, full PPE, and it just was like, well, if I'm traveling like this, is it really safe if I also go and present in this way? So I'm glad that we found an alternative. I'm glad that we were able to come together and have this conversation. I'm so excited to be talking about what I call radical sex positivity or radical pleasure. Both will be addressed absolutely as a means for revolutionary mental health. What does that look like when we're talking about pleasure and sex positivity? What does sex positivity even mean, right? When we are engaging in this conversation, what does that look like? These even radical words like that have just kind of been thrown around and slapped onto whatever to kind of spicing it up, to give it a little razzle dazzle. And sometimes it needs a bit more parsing out before we just apply the terminology. It's important for us to be super clear on whatever it is that we mean by that. So I hope that we are able to do that work in our time together. I know it's short, it's only an hour, but I hope that if we don't get through all of it, that we find the resources to continue having this conversation beyond this space. So what is sex positivity? Is it being open to everything under the sex sun? Being quote unquote positive or affirming of everyone's sexual experiences? Is it being polyamorous or having threesomes? How can you maintain or attain sex positivity in a white supremacist, capitalistic society? Is it possible to ignore systems of oppression and only focus on sex? Throughout this conversation, I will be asserting that sex positivity cannot be attained without addressing what would require a sex positive framework in the first place. I have met professors, aspiring sex educators, sex therapists, social workers, other types of therapists, my friends, right? All who claim a sex positive framework and yet are anti-Black, anti-poor. Their work is inaccessible and rooted in cis heteronormativity. So claiming sex positivity is insufficient. There's also the word radical, right? Which from where I'm standing has become a bit of a buzzword that gets slapped onto everything and it implies very little. Similar to so many folks in the sex ed field, one of my first jobs as a sex educator was working at a sex toy shop as a retail associate. We also called ourselves sex educators, but the store gave no formal training beyond how to explain the products that we were selling. Go figure. I was making about $15 an hour, which is right at minimum wage in New York City, but absolutely not a livable wage. The toys we sold cost more than some of my paychecks. Taking other opportunities is 100% necessary. So when I was approached by the magazine Cosmopolitan to do a talk on blowjobs and their sex talk show, I took it. I sat wedged between, if you could just imagine this for a second, I sat wedged between a topless white cisgender man and a thin white cisgender girl as they gushed about blowjobs and squirmed at the thought of talking about them at work. And this was like in a boardroom, like it was so strange. Although I sat between, the focus of the camera remained on them until they pivoted to the sex expert, who was me. I mentioned that I was a staff at this store called Babeland, because that was in fact the truth. But lo and behold, Babeland fired me just a week after the video was released. The reason? Because I was representing the company without their express permission. At my time at Babeland, all the managers were white. The owners of Babeland are white. And I was one of roughly 3 Black people on the NYC team out of about 100 plus staff. I had no warnings. I was just fired. And I'm quite certain the owners profited more than the staff, and the managers most certainly made more than the retail associates. I tell you this story as in just about every single sector of jobs, Black femmes are always pushed out the fastest, not hired, not given the praise for their contributions, etc. The foundations of this country that I'm standing in, and also perhaps the country that you're in, Canada, would implore all of us to credit Black femmes for their single-handed and oftentimes non-consensual contributions to this world. I am intending that we explore sex positivity and cannot even begin we explore that sex positivity cannot even begin to flourish without a decolonized lens that does not include racism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, policing. Oftentimes our institutions, academic and medical, etc., are committed to keeping these structures in place to maintain white settler colonialism, and it is imperative that we tear it down. So and being in the United States, in the academic world, Canada and Australia is oftentimes cited as making land acknowledgement something that is just a part of conversation. It's just necessary. That is how it begins. That is status quo. That is what we are going to be doing. And I know that we began this conversation with a land acknowledgement of where folks are, especially in particular where Pascal is. I am located on Lenape land in New York. And I also want to also call out that Canada, much like the United States, is continue responsible for displacing and uprooting indigenous land. So although we acknowledge stolen land, it's important that we are actually taking actions to do something about it. And why could I possibly be talking about land acknowledgement if we've already done it, right? Why would I need to come back to that in my conversation around radical pleasure? Well, if you are removing land, removing identity, removing culture, denying folks home and safety, how are they also supposed to explore their pleasure, right? What is the impact on mental health if you oftentimes are fearing that you could be uprooted from everything that you know, that you could be forced into assimilate into whiteness when that was never something that you had any interest in doing, when no one around you potentially is white, and that's not a culture that you were raised in, but that's the culture that would get you a job potentially. That's the culture that would give you some buy-in inside of capitalism. What exactly does that do to the psyche? I think we don't spend enough time talking about psychological warfare and its impacts on mental health, let alone its impacts on pleasure. Redlining is a racist practice in housing where mortgages are oftentimes denied to Black and other marginalized communities. It was a institutionalized practice that happened in the United States beginning in the 1930s that still happens to present day. And, you know, there is a conversation, I think most of you are familiar, that Canada racism doesn't exist. Right? It's not there. There's no anti-Black racism. Anti-Black racism is something that happens in the US. It happens in the South. It doesn't happen in Canada. And we all know that that is so far from the truth. And I went researching about redlining in Canada because I knew that it was something that was actually happening. And I stumbled upon Africville, which was a thriving Black community in Halifax. And this community was bulldozed to the ground in the 1960s to create a space for a dump, a prison, and more affluent housing for white people. And this is a practice that happens in the United States, and it's something that continues to happen in Canada. And I tell you this alongside of talking about stolen land of indigenous communities, because it's important to talk about how Black people have been displaced, and there are also Black indigenous people, let's get that straight, but how Black folks have been displaced by governments in Canada, but also in the United States, right? How, again, could you focus on pleasure if you've been removed from your community, if your community has been stripped of its resources, hospitals, access to sex education in schools, but access to a quality education, right? Because what redlining does is that it takes all of the resources out of the community and puts them into other communities. The intentional practice of really creating places that people would relate to as ghetto or slums or the projects. Those are not natural occurring spaces. They are created by the government, right? And it's important. It's like, okay, how are we considering if spaces like this exist, right? And there are people who are benefiting off of people living in poverty. What then is the impact on people's pleasure? Right? What are the conversations that people are having about their bodies? What are the conversations people are having about the wealth that they have or that they continue to attain or fight for or unable to achieve, right? What is the connection to that and pleasure? And these are my questions to all of you. So I know there's a Q&A at the end, but I think as well, it's important for us to engage in this conversation in a way of like, whoa, I have not thought about how redlining, and now we call redlining today gentrification, how it has impacted people's pleasure. I've never considered that you having access to housing, people having access to housing is directly connected to their ability to perhaps masturbate, right? To have an orgasm. If you're stressed about where you're going to live, or you don't have privacy because you have to share space with multiple family members, what potentially could your pleasure look like? How do we attain radical pleasure when systems of oppression, like the removal of whole communities from where they live, right? How do we attain that if we are sitting in the presence of that reality? I want to move to talking a bit about consent. And oftentimes when we talk about consent, we begin when an assault has happened. But it's actually imperative that we recognize how consent is in literally everything, not just sexual interactions. The United States and Canada, I would say, were not built on a foundation of consent. What do I mean by that? Theft, mass genocide, and manipulation were the methods white settlers used to take land and gain power. The ways in which Black people especially were used as not only labor, but experiment creates a dynamic that our bodies are disposable. Sex positive practices must include consent, understanding that all bodies are not granted the same access or regard. Your thoughts on consent must be racialized, right? Sexual assault is a direct consequence and byproduct of white supremacy. So when we are talking about stolen land and redlining and gentrification, it's also important to apply a radical sex positive lens to that. That is a violation of consent, right? You have left a community without clean water, right? You have literally created a faucet that water will come out of, but you have not provided clean water, right? That is a lack of consent to engage in that sort of housing development, right? You were never informed that that sort of thing will happen, but now it's happening to you, and you have to fight for something as basic as clean water. How could that potentially impact your access to pleasure? Colonizers did not only use physical violence to attain power, they also erased culture and identity. Indian boarding schools were places where indigenous people were forced to cut their hair, remove traditional clothing, and be taught cultural norms of white settler colonialists. This was done in an attempt to forcibly assimilate and control indigenous people into a Western binary. When we read slave narratives, they are oftentimes written from a United States gender lens, a cis heteronormative lens, not considering that all genders have always existed since the beginning of time, as the institution of the gender binary is a tool of white supremacy. The result of enforcing the fallacy of the gender binary has resulted in countless murders of Black trans women. Misogynoir, which is the unique hatred of Black women. Malaysia Booker is a Black trans woman who was murdered in 2019 in the US after going public about a bullying incident that went viral. And Booker is unfortunately a part of a larger trend of Black trans women being murdered. The life expectancy in the US of a Black trans woman is 35 years old. And the outrage isn't loud enough, and neither are the interventions. Saartjie Baartman was stolen from South Africa in the 1800s and brought to Europe to be in human zoos. Large butts were very popular amongst white people, but only a spectacle on Black bodies. She was paraded around on stages, laughed, and gawked at. When she died, her body parts, buttocks, lips, vulva, were put on display in museums in France until her body was returned and buried properly in South Africa in 2003. This happened to her in the 1800s, and her body was brought back to where she was stolen from, where she was from in 2003, and that took the advocacy of her family and also Nelson Mandela. The violence that Baartman endured for the entertainment of the white gaze has not rectified or eradicated. It continues to persist today. So again, I hope you're considering what then is the impact, or how can we access radical pleasure when structures like misogynoir exist, when this history exists and so many of us do not know it, when it continues to reflect today in the presence of seeing white people wear blackface or blackfishing or use African-American vernacular and mimic blackness as a way to attain some sort of attractiveness because it is seen as attractive on a white body than it is on a black person, right? We see that with the family that has attained so much wealth in doing that, the Kardashian-Jenner family, right? And that's just one, but they've attained so much wealth for a particular reason because it's popular to do that. So the same reasons why Saartjie Baartman was stolen from South Africa and put on display is the same reasons we're seeing the disregard and the discard of Black femmes today. I personally was diagnosed with bilateral breast cancer in 2014 when I was 28 years old. I had a mentor that would ask me if I wanted to research breast cancer and pleasure because my mom had passed away from breast cancer when I was 13. I would tell this person over and over again that I wasn't interested. And she said, well, sometimes your calling calls you. I didn't realize it would call me in such a way, but here we are. After 6 months on chemotherapy, I had vaginal dryness, a low libido, and fatigue. My oncologist handed me a large notebook about this thick on symptoms on my first day, and there was nothing about sex in the notebook. When I went topless, displaying my double mastectomy scars in public for the first time, it opened up a swarm of common questions for folks who are oftentimes fat or living with a chronic illness, disability, that folks like that always receive. How did you come to love your body? How did you navigate the changes with your body? Well, it's important to note that these questions would only come from an ableist place, a country that subsists off of discarding people solely on how they look. When we think about body activism, we have to think about the ways bodies are impacted, not just the vanity aspect, as that is also fleeting. Can you really feel good in your body if you do not have access to clean water? Can you really feel good in your body if you do not have affordable health care? Can you really feel good in your body if you cannot afford to pay for food? Does it really matter, right? If I told a bunch of people that I feel good in my body, but my doctors are also not talking to me about how I can get to have an orgasm and I'm entitled to that as a person, period, right? But I am still entitled to that as somebody who has a chronic illness, right? Does it really matter if I feel good in my body? Am I really aware of all the ways that I get to feel good in my body? Or am I only being treated differently in my body because folks who are able-bodied are happy that their body does not look like mine? Sex positivity must include people living with disabilities, people who are fat, people living with chronic illnesses, people living with mental illness. If we are not considering the impacts of mental health on people's bodies and sexual relationships, we are leaving out a large group of people. So what the heck is radical sex positivity or radical pleasure? What is it, Ericka? Radical sex positivity is decolonizing. Sex positivity is actively anti-racist. It is the end of wealth disparity. It is a safe and affordable place to sleep every single night. It disrupts cisgender hetero identity being the standard. It is restorative justice. It is the end of sexually transmitted infection stigma. It is fat bodies existing without contest. It is accessible for all bodies, abilities, and ages. It is very Black, very queer, indigenous, pro-slut, sex worker, Black trans femmes thriving, reparations from the state for Black people. It lifts up the works and contributions of Black people all across the diaspora. Sex positivity is always, always radical. It is not optional. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This entire time I've been sitting here just snapping my fingers. I got so many gems here that you shared. Thank you so much for being here with us, for sharing all of your wisdom. Yeah, really for real took us to school. We are going to have a Q&A as promised, but before doing that, I also just want to remind folks that this is the kickoff event for Inhale Exhale. There's an entire series of programming that is happening for queer and trans folks, racialized queer and trans folks. I'm actually going to pass it on to the curator for Inhale Exhale to announce what the season looks like for us. Rodney? We'll maybe pass it to Rodney in a little bit. I don't know if you're seeing, but there's a bunch of comments in here, folks just thanking you for the talk, saying yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Literally was sitting here the entire time like, yes. Like, when you know something is just juicy and good.
Yes.
So I really appreciate that.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, you really like dropped some things that I really had to like take note,
Yes.
really write down and really think about to kind of take with me. Particularly this piece about Black femmes being pushed out. Black femmes are thanked, Black women and femmes are thanked for saving everything and pushed out quickly. We saw this most recently with the US elections, you know, everyone being like, oh my God, Black women really saved us. Yeah, really and truly. But at the same time, how quickly we are pushed out, how quickly our communities are gentrified, how quickly we are actually neglected, pushed to the complete bottom of everything, really.
Yeah.
And it brings a question to me that I want to pose here, and maybe to get our Q&A starting. Folks, get your questions ready because I'm going to throw it to y'all soon. But a conversation as to what does pleasure look like for stolen people on stolen land? Like, what does it actually look like for us, from us, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
Pleasure that we are able to direct for ourselves and create for ourselves on stolen land.
This is such a great question. What does pleasure look like for stolen people on stolen land? You know, I think we have to admit as stolen folks how much we have inherited from our displacement from the process of colonialism, how that has played a massive role on how we view ourselves and how we view each other, right? Like, I notice how there's agreement in people like Beyonce becoming a billionaire, right? And a lot of agreement around Black folks receiving some sort of accolade and that has agreement in capitalism. And I think it's important for us to remember that capitalism and billionaires don't need to exist, right? Neither one need to exist, regardless if it's a Black person or not. Like, it's still very harmful. It still depends on people living in poverty. It still depends on people having less in order for them to have more. I think there needs to be a really deep, intentional conversation on our own internalized anti-Blackness, how that shows up in our desires to be with a partner or not, what kind of partner we're with, right? Are we with a partner that looks like us, right? Or are we desiring folks who do not look like us? A really great speaker and educator, Hunter Shackelford, talks about pleasure is political, right? Who you are attracted to is 100% inherited, right? It's not just, oh, I have a type and that's just my type and it came from nowhere. Like, no, there's a reason why shows like Love Island and The Bachelor and all these sort of, romance sort of dating shows have one type of person that a lot of people agree is attractive. And they look very similar to what has been passed down to us through colonizers of what is attractive and what is not. And as stolen people, we are the people who are told are not attractive, right? Our bodies have been put, particularly Black femmes, have been put on a stake to say, this is not attractive, but this is. Or if you take parts of this human being, then that is attractive, but not the whole person. Like, we don't want all of that. So I think pleasure looks like, for stolen folks on stolen land, it looks like investigating that, right? It looks like investigating how you have inherited conversations from a colonizer lens, right? How that has impacted your access to pleasure. Do you feel like you can't be with multiple people, right, on a regular basis, or enjoy sex with multiple people all the time, right? Is that impacting you? Do you think that you need to love yourself before you are with a partner, right? That is a function of colonizer thought, like these sort of like very binary thoughts and binary points of views. If you love yourself, you can have a partner. If you don't love yourself, then you're chopped liver. Like, what? Like, no. So those are just a few of my thoughts. But I think, that to begin there of looking at our inherited thoughts. Yeah, it's just a great question.
I love that. I really, really love that. I think something that I took from what you said is that pleasure is also self-accountability and self-reflection. Like, I think a lot of what you've said, I'm like, yeah, a lot of this actually has to look at, has to be, if we are the ones that are going to be the masters of addressing or taking care of our mental health, actually has to start with some of the personal, and has to start with some of the really interrogating, like a self-interrogation with love and with grace and all of the things, in order to actually be able to really be able to experience it. I love that. There is a question before I move on. I could really sit here with you for time, but I'm going to move on to the question that has come in. Question is, what are strategies and tips to shedding ourselves of shame, both internalized and placed on us, as it relates to seeking pleasure as an antidote to the mental health struggles of today?
Oh, what are strategies and tips to shedding ourselves of shame? Sorry, I had to read it again. Oh man, I mean, strategies and tips. One tip that I would say for this question is to surround yourself with people who are going to hold you account to calling out when it is a function of shame, right? I think oftentimes we are literally believing the things that have been said about us as truth, right? Like, for most of my life, people have talked about my hair, right? We know that texturism exists. Your hair is bad. You need to fix your hair. You need to do your hair. You need to put it in braids. You need to grease your scalp. You need to, whatever it is. And I start to literally consume that information to the point where it just becomes real for me. So it makes a difference for me to surround myself, not by folks who are like, yeah, you do need to fix your hair, or yeah, you do. It makes a difference that people are like, your hair is beautiful. I love your hair today. Can I grease your scalp? You get what I'm saying? Like, that makes such a difference to have folks around you who really are interested in you really shedding a lot of that shame. I think too that it's good to consume a lot of media that also does not further sort of bring us shame. And I think, I watch a lot of trash TV, and I have to take breaks from it too, because it starts to bother me, to be honest. And I think you have to, whatever you watch, I think you have to be mindful of how it is implanting itself in your consciousness. right? How is it, playing a role in how you relate to yourself? And in your mental health, right? Like for example, I love true crime, right? That does not help my mental health on a regular basis. Like it makes me anxious, like it makes me worried. And if I'm anxious and worried, am I really going to be able to pull my magic wand out and masturbate before I go to sleep? Or am I going to be freaking out that somebody can come in my room? Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, you just be mindful of the things that you consume in your consciousness. Get you a community that is going to support you, and also start recognizing the things that you're ashamed about, that they are inherited. It's not truth. It's not just you are supposed to be ashamed if you enjoy anal sex. Like, you're supposed to be ashamed of that. Like, no, like that is an inherited thought, mostly rooted in some sort of homophobic bioessentialist weirdness, right? I think it helps to learn about where your shame comes from. That's the intellectual for me, is that I'm like, well, where did it come from that there is this hatred towards fat people? Where did that come from? Because I don't think that is something that is just innate, right? I think we need to remove ourselves from this like very harmful thinking that it's just a part of who we are, and it's just not oftentimes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that answers the question. It's such a great question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, had me sitting here scribbling, trying to get it down. Thank you so much for the question. I'm going to take maybe a quick pause on the questions. Please have them keep coming in. We're going to continue the Q&A. I'm going to pivot really quickly to Rodney, if he's available, to do talk about the Inhale Exhale series this year. You're muted. You're muted, love.
Am I here? Yes. Hi, y'all. Oh my gosh, Ericka. Wow. I have a couple questions even myself. I know some questions are coming in, so I don't want to take too long of time. I appreciate all the words and all the magic and all the wisdom and your presence today. I appreciate all of you who are here on this live. Thank you for coming out. As Ericka said, this live specifically was initially scheduled on March 20th, 2020. Anybody who knows those dates will know what happened essentially a week before we were supposed to do this live. And so we're really feeling really honored and grateful to have a chance to do it, to do sort of this as a bookend to this pandemic. And we're so honored and grateful for your presence, Ericka. This is the opening of this season, the fall 2020 season of Inhale Exhale. And we're so excited to be back again this year for some more feel-good programming for queers of color. The theme and the goal for Inhale Exhale has always been breezy, light, feel-good, heart-centered programming. And we're so excited to have started with what a great way to start thinking about feel-good as talking about pleasure. And so thank you, Ericka, for starting us off. This season continues. We start back the 26th of October, and we go right before the holidays. And the 26th of October, we welcome Irma Villafuerte, who is doing a Grounding Ourselves session. On the 2nd of November, we have a return, a body conditioning sort of collective workout with Tamika, who facilitated last year. We'll be doing a mindfulness with Ekta Hadagandhi on November 9th of this year. November 16th, we're doing something new called Bedroom Vocals, which will have Sasha L. Henry and an accompanist doing a very stripped back hour-long concert for us here of originals. So we're really excited about that. At the end of November, November 23rd, we'll be doing a yoga flow with Robert Halley, another body-based session. On the 30th of November, we'll be doing house with Jazz Fairy J, and that's specifically house dance. So house dance, house music workshop. Super excited about that. It's going to be all levels. And then we wrap up on the 14th of December with a burlesque variety show with Yolanda Bonnell, Babia Morha, and a special guest. And if you were at last year's variety show, you know how wild and fun that got. And so we get to wrap it up, end the year with some great performances. We are going to be announcing our season online. So this was, y'all have the preview in many ways. We'll be putting it up on the Across Boundaries website this week. So crossboundaries.ca/2SLGBTQ is where you can check out the season when it comes out. But you can also follow Across Boundaries on the Instagram, Across Boundaries Mental Health, and on Facebook, Across Boundaries Mental Health. And that all of the weekly events will be populated there as they come. And so if you forget the list that I gave out, make sure you just stay tuned to the social medias. They'll come up. One of us will share it. And we're also super excited to announce that Across Boundaries and Adornment Stories has collaborated on a project that was funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada that will be starting out in the new year. And it is an expansion of Adornment Stories program called Or Stories or Voices. And it will be a 3-year, multi-year engagement specifically focused on Black queer communities. And so there's everything from train the trainer to social events to another gathering, to engage community engagement activities. And we're super excited for this new collaboration, and for the additional programming that's going to come out of that, including a Black queer specific edition of NHL XL running concurrently as the traditional NHL XL. And so look out for info on that. We'll be announcing and giving all the details out at the end of this month. And once again, so grateful. Thank you, Pascal, for hosting and for bringing us together and bringing this space. Thank you so much, Ericka. Thank you, Roger, for your introductions. And I'm just going to pass it right back to you, Pascal.
Thank you. That lineup sounds okay. Thank you, Across Boundaries. Thank you for curating that. That sounds amazing. I see that there's still some questions coming in. We're going to continue with our Q&A with Ericka. Somebody has posed in the chat. I'm curious on how to navigate sex positivity as it relates to figuring out gender identity and moving away from the gender binary.
It's such a great question. I think one is having a commitment to moving away from the gender binary, right? Like looking at how the gender binary has specifically impacted you and the gender that you exist in. When we're talking about the gender binary, we're obviously talking about two genders, the assumption that there's only two, men and women. And there's, with that, a lot of assumptions on how men and women behave. People say women are from Mars and men are from Venus, or the other way around, or some mess. And we're supposed to know what that means, and that's supposed to inform how we are. Like I've heard people say, well, I'm dating a woman and, you know, that's just, they're very sensitive and that's just how they are. And oh my God, my boyfriend, he cried the other day and it was just so beautiful because I never see men cry. And that's all inside of the gender binary, right? What is it like for someone that has been socialized and gendered as a man that they are unable to cry? Literally, we all have the tear ducts to release cortisol, which is literally crying, is literally stress relief. Like this is a mental health conversation, right? What is the impact if you are unable to do that because society says you shouldn't, right? And I think engaging in that conversation makes a difference because we are all unique, right? We are all so different. We are not similar because of some made up gender, right? What are the clothes that you want to wear? Do the clothes you wear really affirm your gender identity? We live in a society that connects gender expression with how you walk, how you talk, how you dress to your gender identity, and they're separate, right? Do you feel really good and, I don't know, a bow tie and some slacks, and that's really what you want to be wearing, but you feel like you shouldn't because of your gender, right? How could that potentially be impacting your access to pleasure if you're unable to exist in your body the way that you want to? This questions like that, like thinking about how you have been forced into a particular gender, right? And never able to explore that. Right? That's also a function of bodily autonomy, being able to explore who you are on your terms rather than what the world has deemed is your gender, right? And you living up to that assumption rather than who you are.
Yeah, that's so important. And again, so many of these, what I really appreciate about the responses that you bring us are all of them seem to be really important questions for us to interrogate internally, for us to actually reflect on these big questions that we avoid or are never really asked to us, are important for us to actually sit down, think about what have we inherited without our consent, what have we been taught without our consent, and what are we actually choosing, how are we actually choosing to understand our own self-autonomy by what are we choosing to believe, what are we choosing to move forward understanding. I love it. I have a question that's actually that's come up. Please keep dropping your questions. I'm gonna take a little break and ask my question. How can we integrate pleasures of principles in principles of pleasure and mental health delivery, understanding that it is across boundaries that have been able to bring us together, across boundaries provides mental health support for individuals from racialized, immigrant, Black communities. How in their service delivery can we actually center principles of pleasure?
Oh, it's so good. I think, it's important to have that conversation there. Like even just asking, like, what does your pleasure look like, right? I feel like there's so many mental health practitioners or spaces that don't even engage in a question about pleasure. Looking for Canadian sex therapists and sex educators to come and speak, or if you can have folks come in from the US and also speak, I think that makes such a difference to have trained, professionals do a talk, but then also just in more intimate one-on-one settings, there is a conversation on, what does pleasure look like to you, right? Are you experiencing pleasure in your relationships right now? And that doesn't have to always mean sexual, right? They get to define that. Now, if they want to talk about what it looks like in a sexual sense, I think that makes a difference too, to kind of consider, are you experiencing pleasure in your sexual relationships? Because I think that's an assumption that we make as well, is that because you're having sex, because there's some sort of intimate relationship, then sex must be happening and everything's fine, right? And that's not necessarily the case. So I think asking questions, getting interested, looking at what are the experiences of the constituents of a cross boundary, like what's happening in folks' lives that could potentially keep them from experiencing pleasure. If we're serving marginalized communities, we know that anti-Black racism is one of the things that folks are up against, right? So holding space for talking about anti-Black racism in a way that people feel held, right? In a way that people feel supported and believed, because that brings me so much pleasure that somebody believed my experience of harm, right? And oftentimes we are denied that, and we are told that we need to provide more evidence, or we need to make it make sense on how it was harmful or how it was racist. Like, it makes a difference if someone's like, I believe you. Like, I know that happened, and I know that was challenging for you, and that's it. Like, that is a pleasurable experience, and a one that marginalized folks oftentimes do not get to experience.
A holistic way of looking at pleasure.
Absolutely.
And it brings me to my next question, right? Understanding across boundary service users are, like I mentioned, newcomers, racialized, immigrants, Black, Indigenous communities. And, I come from a Black immigrant community as well, and understanding how conversations around pleasure not only neglect us, but they're stigmatized in such a way that we actually are unable to even bring it up. And so how do we in our own communities, myself talking to somebody else, part of my community or so forth, how do we have these conversations in ways that are devoid of stigma, but also allow for a nature and a tone that is actually empowering for us to think about the way that you present of pleasure as holistic?
I think it has to begin with talking about how much does it cost to access a therapist, right? Period. And there was I was training social workers not too long ago, and I overheard a speaker say, would you ever offer therapy to someone who was enslaved in slavery? Right? Would you offer therapy to like an indigenous African who was in slavery? Right. And I know that we relate to slavery like it has ended, right? But it hasn't, right? It has continued and it has changed shape and form. So I think we have to get that folks' resistance to therapy has a lot to do with a distrust in institutions. And we all know that racism, classism, transphobia et al. Exist in mental health spaces. So how can we make folks aware that there are spaces where you can go, across boundaries being one, right? That you could actually get supported for who you are and not treated poorly in that space, but actually get held. And I think it's making it accessible. Right? Like making it something that's desirable to do, not something that feels like a task. But if you're like, oh yeah, therapy is going to be like $75 or $100, like where is the sliding scale? Like what does that look like if you want communities that are oftentimes situated alongside of poverty, right? How are you going to tell someone to engage in that if it costs money too? It's just kind of, I think it's unfair in a lot of ways because let's be honest, white folks do not talk about going to therapy either. They just have access to it if they do go, right? Like the financial backing is oftentimes there, not always there, but it is oftentimes there. And two, I think, culturally in a lot of marginalized identities, in particular Black, it's like, don't tell nobody your business. Don't go talking to people about what you have going on. And I think the confidentiality piece, right, has to be shared with folks. I just think that we're not giving people enough information about what therapy is. I think we are sort of beating each other over the head with go to therapy, go to therapy, go to therapy, rather than dealing with the structures that lead people to go to therapy. Right? Like if I don't got no job, if nobody is hiring me, how am I going to therapy? Why are you talking to me about going to therapy if what I need is a job? That means that person needs a job. And that's why I use the example of indigenous Africans enslaved in slavery, because it's like, you're not actually giving folks what they need. You're talking about another institution doing something rather than what needs to be done is emancipation, right? That's what needs to be done. You get what I'm saying?
100 million%. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think at the same time, it puts a particular type of onus on people to be like, go solve your mental health over here. But instead of all of the structural, like your entire talk kind of centered on all of the structural things that actually prevent or contribute to somebody's mental health, right? Yeah. And at the same time, something I also want to say too of, there's so much pressure to be like, go find a therapist here, go find a therapist there. And then sometimes therapists are also anti-Black. Like therapist is also part of the problem. Right? And if they're not thinking about this also from a holistic perspective, thinking about mental health from a holistic perspective, how that can also be very damaging, problematic at best for people. Thank you for that.
Yes, not all therapists are created equal. And also looking for therapists is really freaking hard. Really? Right? It is not easy finding a therapist that you jive with. So I feel like we talk about it getting into therapy kind of callously sometimes. And I think it's a little infantilizing of communities of color who have used so many different indigenous practices to heal, right? And to really hold each other.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's denied oftentimes. And okay, let's be straight up. Let's go there. Let's talk about the history of therapy, right? Let's talk about the history of social work, right? Like what is behind a lot of that? You know, a lot of it is white saviorism. So we have to be mindful of what folks know and what experience folks have had already with these institutions that may be keeping them from engaging with them.
Absolutely. And if your mental health support is solely about, or your mental health, addressing mental health is solely about go speak to somebody, how that actually negates exactly like you said, all of the ways that our communities have had to be in some way or another therapists or social workers for one another. Have we had to bring that support to each other because it hasn't been accessible to us because cost as well as just availability amongst many, 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 many other things. And the fact that in our communities, we don't talk. In our communities, we deal with our issues internally oftentimes, right? So I think that is so important, and thinking about brings me back to exactly what you said about mental health actually has to be holistic. It actually has to be a variety of ways that we are addressing the societal issues rather than thinking of person A as just person A and not person A living in an ecosystem that is contributing to their mental health. Appreciate it. I don't know if you're seeing, but in the chat, folks are like, yeah. They're going,
yes.
Ericka, cool.
So much love across the border.
This is so great in the absence of being able to physically be, with each other and holding space with each other. I think this little community that we've been able to create within this last hour has been really great. I'm going to ask for the last round of questions if there is nothing else. In the meantime, I want to thank everybody for being here, for being a part of this. Honestly, take a look through those comments, Ericka. Exciting season is what folks are saying. Thank you for that question, that part. Well said. Validating the different experiences with acceptance and without judgment to create the safe space right from the start. Absolutely. Is there any last words that you would like to end us off with before I close?
I was just going to say thank you to you. This has been like the best moderated Q&A I've been a part of in a long time. Yes. So the questions were popping. The fact that you're taking notes and engaged, like you're really good at this. And I say that because not everybody is. It's no shade, but you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
Your color is fire. Yeah.
Ericka Hart picking me up.
Yes, gas me up. You deserve it. You deserve it.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Honestly, like Rodney said, we've been really excited about this for the last year. And again,
same.
We've been able to find a different kind of way of doing this. Thank you to Across Boundaries once again for hosting us. Thank you to Roger. Thank you to Tanvir. All of the folks who are here with us. We're going to be watching this afterwards. Thank you so much, Ericka. Thank you everyone for sharing space with us. I hope you all have a beautiful night. Thank you.